Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to what is quickly spiraling into a bear attack area in need of intervention. Western Montana has been featured on this channel time and time again, so this time is no surprise. Near the town of Big Sky is a trail system known as the Yellow Mule Trails. The mountains around the town tower to over 10,000 feet, with Gallatin Peak being the tallest. The steep granite mountains are crowded with expansive stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, and contain pockets of aspen interspersed here and there. Along nearly every body of water, you may find bulrush and willow cushioned by lush grasses between. It is a sportsman's paradise here, but recently it became a sportsman's nightmare. At about 1:45 p.m. on September 8, 2023, 61-year-old Rudy Norlander was up doing what he loved, hunting and being in the outdoors. Rudy is the owner of Alpine Adventures, an ATV rental company in Big Sky. He is a U.S. Navy veteran. Anyone who knew Rudy understood he was always prepared. He was a fan of the hit TV show Survivor and even tried to audition. On this day, he had his bear spray and his high-powered hunting rifle along with him. Rudy loved going to the Yellow Mule's Loop Trail, which is a circuitous route winding through prime deer habitat, but it also leads through prime grizzly territory. Rudy had a client rent some ATVs for their deer hunt, and Rudy had tagged along to hang out. The father and son had walked off a short distance, spotted a deer, and eventually worked their way within shooting distance. After firing a shot at what they thought was a lethal spot on the deer's anatomy, they went down to the location where the deer was standing when they shot. Now, conventional wisdom says that when you track a wounded game animal, you mark your position from where you shot, then proceed to the location where the game animal was wounded. From there, you look for telltale information provided in the surroundings. When a deer is struck with a bullet or an arrow, blood isn't necessarily visible right away, but you can usually see a disturbed pattern in the game animal tracks. The tracks may veer sideways or it may stumble. That may be the location where the game animal was struck by the projectile. After locating the tracks of the wounded animal, blood or tissue evidence should start appearing along the tracks if you hit the game animal in a vital area. Sure enough, the father and son found a decent blood trail indicating their shot was true. It seemed to peter out after following the blood trail for some time. They lost the track and decided to go back up to the ATVs and tell Rudy about what had happened. As soon as they reached the ATV, they told Rudy about how the blood trail had just disappeared and asked him for advice. Rudy wasn't the kind of guy to let a wounded game animal go without doing his best to locate the carcass. Together, the three of them headed back down the trail in search of the blood trail. Rudy knew this area like the back of his hand. He took a familiar trail that led him to the area the other men described and found a blood trail. It turned out that it was a different deer than the one wounded by the hunters, and there were already some very dangerous hunters following this one. In the fall, bears of all sorts are in hyperphagia, which simply means they eat as much food wherever they can find it. They are trying to pack on fat for hibernation and can roam hundreds of miles over a week's time in search of it. They will do desperate things if they have not gained the requisite fat, and have been known to be most active and aggressive during this time of year. A few hundred yards away, Rudy saw an adult grizzly. He decided he would pull his rifle out, just in case he needed to defend his and his fellow hunters' lives. Rudy holed himself up behind a tree and could see a juvenile grizzly a little way away from him. By the time he redirected his attention back to the large grizzly bear, his entire situation had turned extremely dangerous. The giant grizzly, described as being a 10-foot mega grizzly, had closed in on Rudy. He was by himself, having separated from the father and son who were looking elsewhere for the wounded deer. The giant grizzly had suddenly reappeared danger close to Rudy. It isn't clear what brought the bear within such close proximity to the man so quickly. Perhaps his scent had drifted to it on a fickle breeze, but whatever the case, it was now closing in on him with its eyes fixed directly on him. Rudy raised his rifle to his shoulder and yelled, trying to get the bear to stop its charge. As it closed in on him, he knew he had only one option, and he took aim and squeezed the trigger of his hunting rifle. Expecting a loud report and a sturdy kick as the rifle discharged, Rudy was terrified when he only heard the click of the firing pin striking the primer. His hunting rifle had misfired, and at the most crucial time of his life. In the adrenaline-filled moments of a bear attack, victims' brains reportedly process thoughts and information very quickly. Rudy's first thought was to fall down and play dead, but he knew he wouldn't even be able to dive to the ground before the bear would be on him. In a last-ditch attempt at driving the bear off, Rudy swung his fist with all his might and struck the bear in the nose. Rudy's punch bounced off of the grizzly's nose as if it didn't connect. The bear reached out its jaws and clamped them onto Rudy's face like some kind of predatory kiss of death. The single bite from the grizzly's jaws shattered Rudy's lower jaw, and with one shake of its head, his entire lower jaw was torn from his face. Along with Rudy's jaw came a portion of his trachea, which is the cartilage tube we use to breathe. The enraged grizzly began clawing at Rudy's chest cavity, slicing through bones, skin, and flesh with very little resistance. With Rudy's chest torn wide open, the grizzly moved its attack down to his right leg. It bit his leg several times, opening up huge puncture wounds from which his blood poured onto the ground around him. During the attack, Rudy's body was being tossed around like a pillow at a teenager's slumber party. The grizzly then clamped its jaws onto his left bicep and drove its 2-inch-long canines clean through his skin and muscle, opening up several more huge puncture wounds. Now, in prior episodes, we have discussed what really happens when any bear bites a human being. They don't simply clamp down until their teeth come together. They drive their canines through the flesh and use their body mass and strength to pull the flesh away. This nearly always creates a wound cavity beneath the skin that can fill with infection and at least bruise the tissue. If this were a horror movie, you would expect to see the victim lose consciousness, but Rudy stayed conscious through the entire attack. He wasn't a limp body being tossed around during the attack, but chose to fight for his life, yelling, kicking, and punching the grizzly the entire time. A short way around the mountain, the father and son had heard Rudy's screams and the bear's roars. They arrived at the attack scene while the bear was still mauling Rudy, but hesitated to fire their rifle as they didn't want to hit him. They did manage to shoot the bear one time before they grabbed rocks and began pelting the bear as they yelled, trying to run it off. For some reason, the rocks worked. The bear turned around and disappeared into the forest, for now. As they approached Rudy's side, they could see he was near death's door. They fortunately discovered they had cell service. They retrieved their cell phone and reached out to emergency responders for immediate medical attention for Rudy. While waiting for the paramedics to respond, the father and son continually asked Rudy if he was okay. He was missing so much of his face, all he could do was lift his hand and give them an affirmative thumbs up in response. Given the amount of pain and trauma Rudy had just experienced, it seems a medical miracle that he didn't pass out or at least go into shock. The hunters waited with him until they heard the unmistakable sound of the Gallatin County Life Flight helicopter entering the valley. Along with the Life Flight paramedics, the GCSS Air, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Law Enforcement, U.S. Forest Service Law Enforcement as well, and the Gallatin County Sheriff's deputies all responded to Rudy's attack scene. Rudy's route to medical help was met with some confusion. During the attack, he had sustained a complete removal of his lower jaw, partial removal of his trachea, a collapsed lung from the bear tearing open his chest, and numerous other gashes and puncture wounds from the grizzly's claws and teeth. They knew he needed urgent life-saving medical care, but his wounds had to have approached the support limitations of every hospital in the vicinity. At the Bozeman Health Deaconess Regional Medical Center, Rudy underwent surgery to stabilize his condition. Medical professionals there performed a tracheostomy, which is an incision into the trachea to allow air to enter the trachea from an unobstructed pathway. From there, Rudy was flown to the University of Utah Hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he is currently recuperating in the intensive care unit at the time of this video creation. The most recent updates on Rudy's condition indicate that he is off the ventilator now and is doing better. He recently underwent the first of many reconstructive surgeries to repair at least part of the damage done to his face. He reportedly even walked around a bit at the hospital. His daughter indicated that plans to remove one of his fibulas from his lower leg to recreate his lower jaw eventually. For now, he will have a metal plate inserted to replace his jaw for the short term. From the time he was attacked to when he arrived at the hospital in Bozeman, Rudy had been horribly mangled but managed to stay alert and aware for 2 hours. In response to Rudy's attack, authorities have closed the area around Yellow Mule Trail System to any foot traffic and have initiated a search for the giant grizzly bear. A GoFundMe account has been opened up if you would like to help Rudy offset some of his medical bills, and it is linked to in a pinned comment below this video. A few of Rudy's photos have been posted on my Patreon linked below, so if you want to check them out, they are available. If this were the end of this episode, it would be plenty, but I have some more information on a follow-up regarding the episode about Amy Adams's fatal grizzly attack on July 22nd, just about 50 miles south of Rudy's. Just west of West Yellowstone, a sow and cub grizzly had been breaking into cabins and homes in search of food. She had entered through windows and devoured dog food and any other food items she could find. The sow had a single cub that would accompany her during her home invasions. The sow and cub were apprehended after complaints were filed by the residents in the area. DNA evidence was pulled from both grizzlies and compared to the DNA evidence pulled from the scene of Amy's attack. The samples were compared favorably. The same sow was also found to have attacked a man in Idaho 3 years ago near Henry's Lake. Both grizzlies were positively identified as the bears who killed Amy Adamson and were immediately euthanized. In the last month, at least 4 close encounters have been reported to authorities by outdoorsmen. All of the encounters in which the bears were killed were deemed self-defense and the victims were not cited for any violations. Dan Springer, Gallatin County Sheriff's deputy, encourages people who decide to venture into the forests to plan for contingencies. A cell phone that worked and received a signal was integral to saving Rudy's life in this episode, and many other instances of similar occurrences have also been documented. First aid and trauma kits are essential as well. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks issued a statement declaring that Montana is bear country. They state that grizzly populations are increasing in density and are becoming more widespread. The likelihood of people encountering grizzlies will increase in occurrence and frequency. Wow, what an episode. After reviewing the facts surrounding this attack, I am left with a few questions for you. What would you do if you found yourself between 2 different grizzly bears while tracking a wounded deer? Do you plan to put a cell phone into your backpack next time you venture into the forest? What other defensive tools do you recommend for a person to use to defend themselves in addition to bear spray and a high-powered rifle? What factors can you identify that led to Rudy's survival? I will be glad to read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to familiar territory, the eastern slope of the Canadian Rocky Mountains in south-central Alberta, Canada. The area around Wyperus is perhaps the world's current hotbed for grizzly bear attacks. The rolling hills of the Canadian Rocky Mountain foothills invite outdoor enthusiasts of varied interests. Hunters, hikers, campers, loggers, fishermen, and other adventurers are seeking the beauty, resources, and freedom more now than ever before. The forests here are packed with pine, fir, spruce, and aspen trees interrupted by stands of willows and berry bushes along the water sources in the area. Common animals in this area include deer, elk, and moose, and you might even see sheep and goats on the higher peaks to the west. The dominant predators in the area include coyotes, wolves, cougars, black bears, and grizzly bears. It seems that the grizzly bears here are the predatory species that are increasing in their confrontations with human beings. In many of the locations we discuss on this channel, a shortage of food is often a contributing factor to bear attacks, but in this episode, it is actually an abundance of food that does so. On the afternoon of July 19, 2016, 25-year-old Laura Hayworth and her husband James were enjoying sunbathing at Trapper's Campground positioned along the Ghost River. I know what you are thinking. Why do so many of these attacks happen in places with creepy or strange names? In some of the locations of the bear attacks we discuss, the appearance of a mountain shaped like a bear tooth, or named after something with a malevolent sound could be a coincidence, but maybe not. James and Laura had put some thought into their camping trip, at least enough to bring bear spray along with them. They had even practiced dispensing it just in case they may need to. As James and Laura basked in the sunshine just above an embankment along the river, she noticed a rustling in the bushes just a few meters behind them. Laura glanced over and saw something grayish, brown in color moving among the bushes and assumed it was wolves. She stood to her feet and told James to get up. She informed him that she thinks she sees a couple of wolves. James stood to his feet just in time to get a brief glimpse of 2 grizzly bear cubs. As soon as he did so, his vision was filled with the shape of the biggest grizzly bear he had ever seen, emerging quickly from the bushes only 8 feet from him and his wife. As the bear thundered toward the couple, she let out a roar that shook their bones. She growled and roared as she came at them in fear they were a threat to her cubs. The bear closed in on them so quickly that James had no time to react. Both James and Laura fumbled with the safety cap on their bear spray, but it appeared to be jammed. The bear had bore down on them so quickly that they had no time to properly dispense the spray. At a distance of only a few feet, even if they had managed to operate the bear spray correctly, it would not have been able to disseminate the cloud of irritant in an effective manner. The only thing they could have hoped for was a direct shot in her eyes and nose, but they were not able to complete that. Terror filled James as the attack scene from the movie The Revenant flashed through his mind. He thought he was dead, no doubt about it. He knew there was no way he could avoid her. She bowled him over and took him to the ground. Her immense size and weight forced the reality of the futility of resistance into James's mind. James scrambled back to his feet and started yelling at the bear. She returned to him and knocked him down once again. The sow was running back and forth between him and Laura, briefly confused about who posed a greater danger. James' brain was thinking very quickly, trying to process how to handle and escape from the danger posed by the enraged sow. He quickly told Laura to jump into the river, and he began running toward its banks himself. Just as James reached the river shore, he felt the enormous impact of the sow tackling him from behind. The sow had slammed him down onto the edge of the river and was standing over him with her front paws on the back of his thighs. The only thought racing through James's mind was that he was a dead man. This sow had knocked him down and sent him flying through the air, crashing onto the rocks 3 times now in a matter of a few seconds. She was now holding him under water, which would cause him to drown in a matter of a minute or so. This was clearly not a sow looking only to make sure her cubs were safe, but one that wanted to exterminate any threat to them. Whenever bears attack a prey animal in the water, they are frequently witnessed pulling it into deeper water by the neck or back. Then they climb onto it and force its nose or head underwater, utilizing the water to drown their prey. James was now feeling the same urgency as so many moose, deer, or elk may have experienced from a bear attack in water. Suddenly he felt the sow's weight shift and get off of his thighs. He emerged from the water to see the sow now chasing after Laura. Laura was smaller than James, and the bear knocked her down with just as much force. Laura lifted her hands to her face as she screamed in terror, hoping to ward off the bear's jaws from crushing her skull. James again scrambled back to his feet and sprinted toward the bear and his wife. He watched as the bear stood over Laura's outstretched hands as the bear clamped down on Laura's wrist. It began to dash toward the bushes, with Laura bouncing along the ground, in tow. As James gained ground on the bear, dragging his wife, the bear glanced over and saw him. It immediately let go of Laura's wrist and disappeared into the bushes to find her cubs. At this point, James wasn't sure what damage had been done during the lightning-fast bear attack to himself, nor his wife. He ran over to Laura's side and dragged her away from the edge of the bushes. He had hoped the bear would realize the distance between them was safe enough to gather her cubs and flee the area. As James looked up the slope, searching for the bears, he could see the sow and cubs scampering up the hillside. The couple discussed how they could get out of the area without causing another altercation with the sow and cubs. They began making their way along the river shore to a clearer location with bushes. They made noise and yelled as they went, so the sow would know where they were. A little way down the valley, a ranch hand at the Lazy H Ranch, Coleman Blair was helping bring in some hay. He heard the commotion from the attack and looked upstream to see James emerging from the river and Laura underneath the bear as it chewed on her. He usually carried his rifle whenever he went to work, but for some reason he left it at home on this day. By the time he arrived at James and Laura's location, the bear had made its way across the river and was emerging on the opposite bank. In a matter of minutes, James and Laura heard a man's voice yelling in reply to their cries for help. Up at the top of the cliff, they could see 2 men, one with a red shirt and the other with a dark shirt. James and Laura yelled, "Help! Help!" and told them there was a bear nearby. The 2 men indicated they knew of the bear and could see that it had departed the immediate area. James and Laura could see one of the men scrambling down the cliff toward them as the other stood watch from above to keep an eye on the sow's location. Blair ran down a large embankment towards the scene. The bear had moved away to the other side of the river by the time he reached James and his wife. He could see Laura's wrist was clearly broken due to its misshapen appearance. She had several deep bite wounds, scrapes, and cuts from being dragged across the rocky ground. James didn't have any bite wounds, but was scraped and bruised from the encounter. He also had an indelible bear paw-shaped bruise on his hamstring from where the sow stood on top of him at the riverbank. Blair stated later that when you see someone getting chewed on by a grizzly, you really can't just stand around. Due to his response, a follow-up attack by the sow may have been avoided. As soon as Blair had reached the couple's location, the three of them began making their way back up the steep embankment. He stated later that Laura was very shaken up by the experience and was chewed up pretty badly. As soon as they had reached the top, James dashed off to fetch the vehicle and rush his wife to get medical attention. He jumped into the vehicle and peeled out toward his wife, sending dirt flying as he went. Blair helped load Laura into the vehicle, and she and James quickly disappeared back down the road in a cloud of dust. A short distance down the dirt road, an ambulance pulled into view. The couple skidded to a stop, and the paramedics went to work on Laura. They began to assess her injuries and bandage them according to severity. They also radioed in for a medical helicopter team to respond for urgent care for Laura. The helicopter arrived at their location a short while later. The entire time the paramedics worked on Laura, she pled for them to tend to her husband, worried that he was also injured by the angry sow. They loaded Laura into the helicopter and flew her to the nearest hospital while James drove himself there in their vehicle. Later, James stated that people need to understand that animals must be respected. He continued to acknowledge that if the sow had wanted to tear them limb from limb, she would have done so. He accepted her behavior as her way of saying, "These are my cubs, get away," and is grateful that the outcome wasn't worse. An inspector with the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Branch indicated that bear attacks in the Waiparous area aren't that rare anymore. He stated that they have seen a half-dozen bear attacks within the last few years. The attacks have ranged from bluff charges to painful bites to serious maulings. Authorities took clothing from James and Laura to try to pull DNA from the sow's slobber that may have been present on the clothes. They plan to analyze it in an attempt to link the sow with any future problems they may have with her. When it comes to a sow defending her cubs, authorities are always cautious in reacting with lethal force. They stated that grizzlies play an integral part of the ecosystem, and removing one has ripple effects on many other animals and plants in the area. They also plan to close the area for a lengthy amount of time to allow the sow and her cubs to make their way through it. Biologists indicated that this year's wild berry yield in the Waiparous area was a bumper crop compared to adjacent ecosystems. The plentiful food source brought grizzlies from miles around to the location to feast on the sugary, nutritious delicacies to help them gain weight needed for hibernation. This food source is particularly important to sows and cubs, given there is no annual reliable salmon runs around there. After reviewing the details of this episode, I am left with a few questions for you. Do you think the attack was a territorial attack or a defensive one? Could this attack have been avoided if James and Laura hadn't stood to investigate the rustling in the bushes near them? Would a firearm have changed the outcome of this attack, or did it happen far too fast? Would you expect to be attacked by a protective sow when you are sunbathing on a river embankment? As an added challenge, let's see who can list the most contributing factors that led to Laura's survival. I will be glad. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the small town of Grand Isle, about 325 kilometers northwest of Prince George. It is in central British Columbia, Canada, along Babine Lake, and is one of the best locations in the world to view grizzly bears during the sockeye salmon runs from August to October each year. The Fulton River Project near Grand Isle is a man-made salmon spawning bed, with the first channel being constructed in 1965 and the second in 1971. These channels are about 5 miles long and allow sockeye fry to take advantage of the ideal rearing potential in upstream Babine Lake. Annually, these channels have the capacity to produce 135,000 adult salmon, as well as provide jobs to area residents. About 2,000 people visit the channels each year to watch the grizzly bears fight for prime salmon fishing locations and gather the calories they need for survival. When the grizzlies show up here, they take part in a massive cycle of nutrients that originates here and extends into the Pacific Ocean, where the majority of the salmon life cycle occurs. The fry and smolt spend the first 3 years of their life in the confines of fresh water before making their way downstream to the ocean. While feeding in the ocean, sockeye salmon can grow up to about 2.5 feet in length and up to around 15 pounds. After 2 years in the ocean, they are approaching the end of their life cycle, which culminates in them making their way up the exact same watersheds from which they came, and frequently returning to the same gravel beds from which they hatched to breed the next generation. Bears, wolves, and other animals help circulate the nutrients to the areas surrounding the streams by carrying the salmon carcasses into the brush, thereby fertilizing the plants there. Any disruption in this 5-year cycle in the important source of protein, fat, and nutrients that bears need can disrupt or stress grizzly populations. As far as nutrients that grizzlies get from salmon, here is a quick breakdown. They typically prefer the brain and roe, which are the eggs, as well as the skin of salmon. Each tablespoon of roe offers bears or any consumer about 2 grams of protein and 1 gram of carbohydrates. Each female salmon produces between 600 to 800 eggs per pound of body weight. That means a single female salmon, called a hen, weighing 10 pounds can produce between 6,000 to 8,000 eggs for her reproductive life cycle. The skin and brain of the salmon offer important sources of fats and vitamins as well, but the roe is the bear's big payoff when it comes to salmon. The geography around Grand Isle is mountainous, with valleys lined by dense stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, with a thick forest floor of alder, willows, and berry bushes. Mule deer, elk, bison, and moose are common forest dwellers you may see in this area. Predators here include coyotes, mountain lions, wolves, black bears, and grizzly bears. Each of these predators balances on an ecological food system which overlaps in part with each other. At around 7 a.m. on September 29, 2021, a 70-year-old photographer, whom we will call Jack, was vying for position to take pictures of the grizzlies as they fished for salmon. Getting a good photograph of a grizzly while it is fishing is an amazing and captivating pursuit that can lead to an image representing 2 successful recovery stories. Both salmon and grizzlies have been protected and growing since preservation efforts started around the middle of the last century. As Jack walked down an access road that went along the Fulton River project, he searched for a perch to observe the bears. This project diverts water from the adjacent Fulton River and directs it along a winding series of engineered gravel breeding areas called redds. All along the river, grizzlies gather to compete to catch the salmon as they migrate toward the redds to finish their life cycle. Grizzlies do not normally tolerate close proximity with each other or humans, but due to the abundance of food here, they can be found in high numbers. They are so focused on finding and defending their location to catch fish that photographers and onlookers will frequently find themselves within a few yards of bears without much threat. This creates an illusory atmosphere in many human visitors' minds. They sometimes slip into a relaxed mindset, believing the bears to disregard human presence. The dense undergrowth along the Fulton River provides very good cover for any animal there. The grizzlies navigate the area on a bear-established trail system which weaves its way along the banks and periodically emerges onto human trails and roads.
As Jack walked along the access road with his camera and gear in hand, he approached one of these junctions at a very inopportune time.
Unbeknownst to Jack, a grizzly was just leaving the riverside along a trail and converging on his travel route. Surprising a bear, even one with a belly full of salmon roe, is never a good idea. As soon as the bear saw the man within just a few yards of itself, its fight or flight reaction took over, and the fight reaction of a bear is always dangerous to a human. If you surprise me, you might just get punched in the nose, but a bear doesn't have fists, so you can imagine the equivalent reaction. The bear blitzed the man in a blur of brownish fur and roaring teeth. Jack held out his arm as a means to maintain separation between his body and the angry bear. In an attack that lasted only a few seconds, the grizzly clamped its jaws onto Jack's arm and tossed its head back and forth, tearing holes the size of quarters into his forearm and upper arm. The attack consisted of several bites in rapid succession before the bear dashed off into the bush. I may be dating myself by saying this, but some grizzlies are slightly smaller than a Volkswagen Bug from the 1960s, and you may be dating yourself by understanding my meaning. Most people think an animal the size of a small vehicle would be easy to spot and avoid, but even a large bear can move with amazing speed. Before Jack could process the events that transpired, the bear was gone, and he was lying on his back along the access road. It wasn't but a few minutes before other photographers and visitors in the area arrived at Jack's side after hearing him yelling during the attack. They could see the enormous holes in his arm gashed by the bear's teeth and comforted him while calling for medical assistance. Jack was loaded up and flown to a hospital in Prince George, a little more than 150 miles away. Once there, his condition was stabilized and his wounds were sutured closed. His injuries were not life-threatening, but were imparted in such a rapid manner that a prolonged attack may have threatened his life or may have cost him his arm. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the nearby town of Houston were sent out to respond to Jack's Grizzly attack. They worked in conjunction with the Conservation Officer Service in the investigation. Given that the bear and Jack met along a brush-covered roadside, the investigators deemed the attack as a strictly defensive attack and decided that no further action would be taken against the grizzly. It was decided the bear was not acting as a nuisance to humans and would not be killed or relocated. The Conservation Officer Services issued warnings to visitors about surprising bears and encouraged the public to take precautions against it. Packing bear spray and making a lot of noise may prevent confrontations and attack when traveling through bear country. They encourage people to stay aware of their surroundings and travel in groups as much as possible. Conservation officers here have received an average of 138 calls each month in BC in the month of September each year. Only 32 of those calls required a response by an officer. Over this time frame, only 3 grizzlies have had to be killed due to danger or nuisance to humans. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think it is wise to reintroduce grizzlies into their former habitat in areas without re-establishing salmon runs which helps them survive? How do you think Jack may have avoided this attack? Do you think bear spray would have prevented this attack? Would you feel safe walking along an access road near a river lined with giant, hungry grizzly bears? Do you run away or punch at people when they jump scare you? I will be happy to read and reply to your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.